Hello everyone and welcome to our adult story time. Today we're going to be reading One of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And specifically we're going to be reading The Golden Pince-Nez. And since this story would take about an hour or so to read aloud, I'm going to be nice and I'm going to split it up into smaller videos. Hopefully about 10 minutes or so. So I'll label those clearly so you can follow along whichever step of the way, whichever part of the story we're in. And I am reading from the Sherlock Holmes collection book that we have upstairs in the library in the reading lounge. So, let's begin, shall we? The Golden Pince-Nez. When I look at the three massive manuscript volumes which contain our work for the year 1894, I confess that it is very difficult for me, out of such a wealth of material, to select the cases which are most interesting in themselves, and at the same time most conducive to a display of those particular powers for which my friend was famous. As I turn over the pages, I see my notes upon the repulsive story of the Red Leech, and the terrible death of Crosby, the banker. Here also I find an account of the Addleton tragedy, and the singular contents of the ancient British borough. The famous Smith-Mortimer succession case comes also within this period, and so does the tracking and arrest of Uret, the boulevard assassin, an exploit which won for Holmes an autographed letter of thanks from the French president and the Order of the Legion of Honor. Each of these would furnish a narrative, but on the whole, I am of the opinion that none of them unites so many singular points of interest as the episode of Yoxley Old Place, which includes not only the lamentable death of young Willoughby Smith, but also those subsequent developments which threw so curious a light upon the causes of the crime. It was a wild, tempestuous night, towards the close of November. Holmes and I sat together in a silence all the evening. He engaged with a powerful lens, deciphering the remains of the original inscription upon a palimpsest. I deep in a recent treatise upon surgery. Outside, the wind howled down Baker Street, while the rain beat fiercely against the windows. It was strange there, in the very depths of the town, with 10 miles of man's handiwork on every side of us, to feel the iron grip of nature, and to be conscious that to the huge elemental forces, all London was no more than the molehills that dot the fields. I walked to the window and looked out on the deserted street. The occasional lamps gleamed on the expanse of muddy road and shining pavement. A single cab was splashing its way from the Oxford Street end. "Well, Watson, it's as well that we have not to turn out tonight," said Holmes, laying aside his lens and rolling up the palimpsest. "I've done enough for one sitting. It is very trying for the eyes. So far as I can make out, it is nothing more exciting than Abbey's accounts dating from the second half of the 15th century. Hello, what's this?" Amid the droning of the wind, there had come the stamping of a horse's hooves and the long grind of a wheel as it rasped against the curb. The cab, which I had seen, had pulled up at our door. "What can he want?" I ejaculated, as a man stepped out of it. "Want? He wants us, and we, my poor Watson, want overcoats and cravats and galoshes and every aid that man ever invented to fight the weather. Wait a bit, though. There's the cab off again. There's hope yet. He'd have kept it if he had wanted us to come. Run down, my dear fellow, and open the door, for all virtuous folk have long been in bed." When the light of the hall lamp fell upon our midnight visitor, I had no difficulty in recognizing him. It was young Stanley Hopkins, a promising detective, in whose career Holmes had several times shown a very practical interest. "Is he in?" he asked eagerly. "Come up, my dear sir," said Holmes's voice from above. "I hope you have no designs upon us such a night as this." The detective mounted the steps, and our lamp gleamed upon his shining waterproof. I helped him out of it, while Holmes knocked the blaze out of the logs in the grate. "Now, my dear Hopkins, draw up and warm your toes," said he. Here's a cigar, and the doctor has a prescription containing hot water and lemon, which is good medicine on a night like this. It must be something important which has brought you out in such a gale. It is indeed, Mr. Holmes. I've had a bustling afternoon. I promise you. Did you see anything of the Yoxley case in the latest editions? I've seen nothing later than the 15th century today. Well, it was only a paragraph, and all wrong at that, so you have not missed anything. I haven't let the grass grow under my feet. It's down in Kent, 7 miles from Chatham, and 3 from the railway line. I was wired for a 3:15, reached Yoxley Old Place at 5, conducted my investigation, was back at Charing Cross by the last train, and straight to you by cab. Which means, I suppose, that you are not quite clear about your case? It means that I can make neither head nor tail of it. So far as I can see, it is just as tangled a business as ever I handled. And yet at first it seemed so simple that one couldn't go wrong. There's no motive, Mr. Holmes. That's what bothers me. I can't put my hands on a motive. Here's a man, dead. There's no denying that. But so far as I can see, no reason on earth why anyone would wish him harm. Holmes lit his cigar and leaned back in his chair. Let us hear about it, said he. I've got my facts pretty clear, said Stanley Hopkins. All I want now is to know what they all mean. The story, so far as I can make out, is like this. Some years ago, the country house at Yoxley Old Place was taken by an elderly man, who gave the name of Professor Coram. He was an invalid, keeping his bed half the time and the other half hobbling around the house with a stick, or being pushed about the grounds by the gardener in a bath chair. He was well liked by the few neighbors who called upon him, and he has the reputation down there of being a very learned man. His household used to consist of an elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Marker, and of a maid, Susan Tarleton. These have both been with him since his arrival, and they seem to be women of excellent character. The professor is writing a learned book, and he found it necessary, about a year ago, to engage a secretary. The first two that he tried were not successes, but the third, Mr. Willoughby Smith, a very young man, straight from the university, seems to have been just what his employer wanted. His work consisted in writing all the morning to the professor's dictation, and he usually spent the evening in hunting up references and passages which bore upon the next day's work. This Willoughby Smith had nothing against him, either as a boy at Uppingham or as a young man at Cambridge. I have seen his testimonials, and from the first he was a decent, quiet, hard-working fellow with no weak spot in him at all. And yet this is the lad who has met his death this morning in the professor's study, under circumstances which can only point to murder. The wind howled and screamed at the windows. Holmes and I drew closer to the fire, while the young inspector slowly and point by point developed his singular narrative. If you were to search all of England, said he, I don't suppose you could find a household more self-contained or freer from outside influences. Whole weeks would pass, and not one of them would go past the garden gate. The professor was buried in his work, and existed for nothing else. Young Smith knew nobody in the neighborhood, and lived very much as his employer did. The two women had nothing to take them from the house. Mortimer, the gardener, who wheels the bath chair, is an army pensioner, an old Crimean man of excellent character. He does not live in the house, but in a 3-roomed cottage at the other end of the garden. Those are the only people that you would find within the gardens of Yoxley Old Place. At the same time, the gate of the garden is 100 yards from the main London to Chatham road. It opens with a latch, and there is nothing to prevent anyone from walking in. Now I will give you the evidence of Susan Tarleton, who is the only person who can say anything positive about the matter. It was in the forenoon, between 11 and 12. She was engaged at the matter in hanging some curtains in the upstairs front bedroom. Professor Coram was still in bed, for when the weather is bad he seldom rises before midday. The housekeeper was busied with some work in the back of the house. Willoughby Smith had been in his bedroom, which he uses as a sitting room. But the maid heard him at that moment pass along the passage and descend to the study immediately below her. She did not see him, but she says that she could not be mistaken in his quick, firm tread. She did not hear the study door close, but a minute or so later there was a dreadful cry in the room below. It was a wild, hoarse scream, so strange and unnatural that it might have come either from a man or a woman. At the same instant there was a heavy thud, which shook the whole old house, and then all was silence. The maid stood petrified for a moment, and then, recovering her courage, she ran downstairs. The study door was shut, and she opened it. Inside, young Mr. Willoughby Smith was stretched upon the floor. At first she could see no injury, but as she tried to raise him, she saw the blood that was pouring from the underside of his neck. It was pierced by a very small but very deep wound, which had divided the carotid artery. The instrument with which the injury had been inflicted lay upon the carpet beside him. It was one of those small sealing wax knives to be found on old-fashioned writing tables, with an ivory handle and a stiff blade. It was part of the fittings of the professor's own desk. At first, the maid thought that young Smith was already dead, but on pouring some water from the carafe over his forehead, he opened his eyes for an instant. "The professor," he murmured. "It was she." The maid is prepared to swear that those were the exact words. He tried desperately to say something else, and he held his right hand up in the air. Then he fell back dead. So, there are very strange things going on in Yoxley Old Place. So, I will continue this story in the next video segment, and I hope that you'll come back to listen to it again. So, this was again The Golden Pince-Nez by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, one of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And you can find this particular book upstairs at Bosler Library. So, I hope you enjoyed our story time, and I hope you'll come back for more.